Hey lovelies, Lisa here with a comparison video of 3 of the most easily purchased copies of Pamela Colman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite's 1909 collaboration, what became through the Rider publishing company, the Rider-Waite or Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot deck, and now is produced by US Games. The A.E. Waite Premium Tarot deck, this comes with the orange box. This was a German edition. The English edition would only differ from this in that the titles would be in English, not in German. This is AGM's version, and that's pretty widely available. Even in the US, you can get copies of it fairly easily. And then this relatively more recent version of the deck, the importer, maybe he's the CEO or owner or marketer for Siren Imports, for this imprint called Brigh. It's a Chinese-produced deck, and it, like these 2 editions, is based on the artwork from the Pam A, what's called the Pamela A version of Waite-Smith's deck. That's the version that was published originally by Rider Company, Rider and Sons later, in 1910 to 1920. This version has been sort of digitally remastered from that original artwork. The color sort of amped up, the pixelation has been taken away, and it's a really interesting addition to the world of this iconic modern tarot. Now, in a recent video, I talked about 5 aspects of tarot quality, really talking about the Waite-Smith deck. I talk about cardstock, I talk about color, clarity, calligraphy, meaning what happens with the titles, and I talk about copyright, whether the deck is branded, whether it has a copyright on the corner. And to me, you know, each of these versions of the deck does a really great job with 4 of those 5. No one of them does a great job with all 5. So that's kind of just worth knowing, you know. If you want a deck that has no copyright, that excels with cardstock, that excels in the color and the clarity of the images, that has the original calligraphy, you're gonna need to get like a 1971 version of this deck. You're gonna need a vintage deck. So the Holy Grail has yet to be produced. But each of these 3 excels in different ways, and it's interesting to look at them. They're all based on the same version of the deck. So, yeah. And the thing to know when we think about color is, to some extent, you know, we can talk about whether these colors match the original coloring in the Pam A. I happen now to have access to a Pam A because I'm an incredibly lucky and happy woman. But even when you have access to a Pam A, you know, you have a deck that's now 110 years old. Knowing what the original color was is impossible. And even if we could find a time warp edition of the Pam A where the colors are, we know, completely comparable to what they were like when they were first produced in 1910, we still wouldn't know what Pamela Colman Smith wanted for the coloring of this deck, because she did not color the deck herself. She submitted drawings, black and white line drawings. So color is really kind of in the eye of the beholder. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the comparison. So right off the bat, we can see that the color for the US Games edition is a little bit warmer. And that's kind of consistent throughout all 3 of these. The other thing we can talk about right off the bat is cardstock. So of these 3, the Siren Imports Brigh version has, I think, the nicest cardstock. The US Games is this latest version of the US Games, the brand new version of the US Games, which preserves the original calligraphy, has pretty nice cardstock. This cardstock is the thinnest of the three. The AGM cardstock is the thinnest of the three, but it has a very nice pliable feel to it. And in my hands, I prefer this version to the US Games. Let's talk a little bit about finish. And I'm hoping, let me see if we can actually. So this version of the deck has a linen finish, which is like what you would see on a bicycle deck of playing cards. I happen to love linen finish. It makes the deck shuffle really nicely, and to me it finishes the cardstock off beautifully. Neither of the other two has that linen finish. Both have about an equivalent level of gloss. So that semi-glossy, not quite matte, not that buttery soft matte, but not really glossy finish. The other thing I want to say is, and this wasn't one of my 5 C's because it's backing, it's a B, we're going to have to add a B to the list, is if we think about the backs of these cards, this is of course a matter of personal preference unless you're trying to be faithful to the Pam A. If you're trying to be faithful to the Pam A, the only crackleback edition of the deck, the only deck that's available widely now that has the original backing, is in fact the A.G. Mueller version of the deck. The modern, the most recent US Games version has that. This is sort of hard to explain, but if you think about the way decks were originally produced, where the backing is just goes over a whole sheet of all 78 cards and then the cards are cut, that's not how backing is applied now because it's all digital. And you can see that in the way that when you're looking at the side version of the deck, you get this striation because each of these has the same exact backing image on it. And that gives, to me, it cheapens the backing. So I don't like the modern plaid back of US Games cards, but I do like the vintage plaid backing. This is a personal preference. I really don't like the backing of the Siren Imports version of the deck. The other thing I want to say about cardstock is that the Siren Imports version of the deck has the heftiest cardstock of all 3. Although, it's by far heftier. I really like the card. I sort of can't say enough about the cardstock with the de Brigh. It's my favorite feature of the de Brigh deck. Another thing to say, and let's move on to another card, is color. And the de Brigh version of the deck really went out of its way to get rid of the sort of old technology printing, artifacts of the old technology printing process that are still present in the deck. The way, for instance, that solid blocks of red, like in the table or in the mountains for the lovers, have this cross-hatching that reflects an older printing technique, which we don't need to use anymore. So in this deck, all of the colors in the de Brigh deck, the Siren Imports deck, all of the colors are not pixelated or cross-hatched. They're all solid blocks of color. And that can be really pretty. That can give more clarity to the cards. But if what we're after is something that really recreates the Pam A, you lose that line, kind of the fidelity to line that we see in the Pam A. This is really kind of obvious when we compare the A.G. Mueller High Priestess, a card like this, with the Siren Imports, where the kind of muted color of the High Priestess's cloak, which is in part muted because of the choice of color and in part muted because of the way that the ink was originally applied to the card, that disappears and we just get sort of this corn silk blue. So to my eye, something is lost here. But you get a much more contemporary kind of feel to the color. You do have less subtlety in the shading in certain aspects. So this just ends up being like kind of patch of white, which doesn't really make sense. If you look at the more faithful version, you realize, oh, that's the way they did shading. But then it just becomes, in this version, even less nicely handled than the US Games version. In some of the cards, that relationship to shading really produces something that doesn't make a lot of sense, like the stripes of gray. Again, those stripes of gray, this new digitizing effort to get rid of things like cross-hatching and pixelation, those stripes of gray are trying to capture what was originally a much more subtle effort to indicate shadow and highlight. So I think I would say this Siren Imports version needs to go back to the drawing board with each of the cards, kind of really comparing it back to Pam A, to see, like, okay, well, what is the detail that's missing here? How has that gotten skipped over in the remastering of the images process? So you have here, this background is a solid kind of orangey red. It was cross-hatched in the original, no doubt, because that was the best way to print that block of red, or maybe the least expensive way to do it. So some of these cards are kind of more interesting, more faithful or not. I like what's happened to the mountain here, where you've gotten a kind of more textured. And then, the purple of the robe, I mean, this is just a more brilliantly colored version of the card. And that's nice. The flesh tones are more flesh tony, right? It's nice. I haven't even said anything about the fact that we don't have branding. We don't have a copyright here. So that's a big win. But again, subtlety gets lost. This is a really important interpretive point, that the lady's wreath around her waist is also wrapped around the lion's mane. And that gets mostly lost in many modern versions. It's completely lost here. The wreath really clearly ends behind the lion versus wrapping around the lion. I think the Hermit is an example of when this deck really hits out of the ballpark. Just the colors are really nice. The clarity of the image is really nice. I think of the three, this is the nicest Hermit card. Similarly, I think Justice is beautiful. But, yeah, I like Death. I have to say I like Death here. Something weird happens to the foot in the Temperance. I guess this is trying to show a foot underwater, but the foot actually has, I guess, or maybe there's just a mistake here. Sometimes it's hard to know if it's intentional or just a mistake. Was the foot echoing the rock? So some weird stuff like that. But, the Devil, I think, is a great success. I really like the Tower as well. And just holding the cards in my hand. I mean, the cardstock, it's really, if you like the linen finish, the cardstock in general, the cardstock of this deck is really nice. It just has that feel on my fingertips. The star does a good job. Other than the red eye and the kind of red splotch in the mouth of this dog, well, I guess that is echoing. I mean, the A.G. Mueller is more faithful to the Pam A than the new Rider Waite, the new US Games version. But so I guess that red splotch, I'd have to look at the Pam-A to make sure. I guess the red eye and the red tongue maybe is in the Pam-A, but it's overdone here in a way that's a little problematic. Interestingly, the Sun card is, I think, does a good job. But interestingly, this Sun card, they removed the squiggle. So this Sun card echoes a Pam-A in all of the details except for the squiggle, which is a problem because the squiggle is part of what makes a Pam-A a Pam-A. So this is not a Pam-B, but like the Pam-B, it removes the squiggle. It's interesting. It's like it's removing the mistakes, but the mistakes are part of what makes the card what it is historically. So, you know, that's an interesting dilemma there. I have to say that the importer, so this guy, Siren, the guy who contacted me at Siren Imports, you know, he listens to feedback. So earlier editions of this, the original tarot, the child's hair was kind of green. They had an error in the digitization process, and now the hair is not green anymore. So, you know, I think giving feedback will make a difference here. I think the Judgment card is a big success. Same with the World card. Oops. Uh-oh. Hold on. Let me get these in order. I love that they've taken such care with getting the kind of halo around the hands, with making sure that this is something that isn't in the US Games version, making sure that the color of the pentacle carries over. It is in the A.G. Mueller. You know, basically you have to like do these one card at a time to really make sure that you don't screw anything up. In many respects, I still really like the more muted colors in the A.G. Mueller version of the deck. But I think often the colors for the original tarot, the Siren Imports, I think that they're really nice. They're kind of in between in terms of saturation. They're kind of in between the A.G. Mueller and the US Games. They're less saturated than the US Games, more saturated, richer than the A.G. Mueller. Face tones tend to be more human, right? Or Caucasian. You know, you've got the really washed out coloring of the A.G. Mueller. Here, you have real flesh tone. But then again, that problem with digitization, where what started out as an effort to give shading then becomes just splotches of color, that seems to be a mistake. That happens in the Siren Imports. I think this card is really successful. Now this card, people often talk about how important it is that some of the leaves are green and some are brown. In the Pam-A, it's really the original Pam-A, the 1910. The differentiation between the leaves is not so powerful, not so obvious, and maybe isn't even a thing. It's very hard to tell. It becomes more of a thing over time with the US Games interpretation of the deck, of the card. And so then people think, oh, that's an important point, that the vine is slightly dying. I'm not convinced it's historically an important part of the deck, and so I'm not bothered by these all being green. And I kind of like the pink, the highlighting of the pink earth here. I think the colors are they're lovely. I think here the US Games version does that splotching much more than the Siren Imports version. I think these complicated cloaks that we see in the 10 of Pentacles and then again in the King of Pentacles, I think they work. Oops. Where's my 10? I think they work better in the Siren Imports than in the US Game version. But the A.G. Mueller version does a good job too. You know, again, this is a good card to see the benefits of this deck. So you're getting the idea here, I think. You know, that at its best, this deck does a much better job with flesh tones, that the cardstock is wonderful. We don't have the copyright, that some of the coloring is just, it's more saturated than the A.G. Mueller in a way that I find really pleasing. It's less saturated than the new US games, which to me always feels like we've made the deck really garish. So you're getting a sense of that. But there is one card that is the deal breaker for me in this deck, and it's the Prince of Cups. I'm sorry, the Knight of Cups. So what do you notice with this card? This is just a mistake. That's just not good. So by and large, the problems with the digitization are not bad problems in this version, but that missing belly is a problem. And it's a problem that we see in the US games because it looks like a line is missing actually in the Pam A. And so this card, as it's been reproduced over time, has presented a problem. There's no belly line here. So then you have to figure out, where do I fill the color in? How should that work? And it's a problem for all modern decks, but it's a problem I never noticed until the Siren Imports version of the deck appeared. So in the end, I would say this deck, cost-wise, this deck is the cheapest of the three on Amazon right now. It is a really well-done deck. It's got some problems. I hope that Siren Imports works with their Chinese manufacturer to improve it, continue to improve it. I would love a different backing. My guess is that the crackle back is not available, or there's some copyright concerns, but I think there's so many ways that you could do a back that would be more in keeping with the flavor of the historical deck. Fix the Knight of Cups. I would actually have someone just draw in a line there. But none of these is the Holy Grail, which is probably why, if you're like me, you own all of these, plus many more. Okay, if you want me to do an even longer version of a look at this deck or a comparison, let me know. But hopefully this has kind of given you a sense of what the original tarot offers. And if, like me, you appreciate a good linen finish, yeah, I would recommend picking this up and giving it a shuffle. All right, y'all. Hope this has been interesting and helpful. Eager to hear your comments below. And yeah, the search for the Holy Grail continues. I gotta say, I'm still pretty happy with the CS Tarot, and I'll put a link to my my video on that deck below. Okay. Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay happy and sane. And as always, thank you so much for your practice.